to the next one. So the next one is taking the vector norms. So vectors, we can take L1 norm, we can take L2 norm, and so on. And this is some of the operations that we have defined previously. So let's carry out how do we do this in Python. So again, we are focusing on vector norm. Let's say if you do L1 norm, right? How do we do it? Again, this will be essentially carried out using NumPy library. Okay, so what we do is we first define a vector. So vector used np.array, and then we print this vector. And then if you want to calculate this L1 norm, we will call this function norm. Okay, so this norm function, and we'll take as an input the vector for which it needs to be taking the norm and the type of norm it should be computing. So since we are computing L1 norm, the input to this function is 1. So if you look into this line of code, which is L1 underscore norm is equal to norm, and in the round parenthesis we have vec comma 1. So norm is the function from the numpy that is used to compute the norm of a given vector, and it has two inputs, the vector itself and the type of norm it should be taking. So since we are focusing on L1 norm, you will see in this function the second entry is comma 1, which specifies that we are taking the first or L1 norm of the vector vec. Okay, so let's execute this function and see what it looks like. So if we have this vector 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, what is the L1 norm, right? Essentially that is equal to 15. And what L1 norm computes, if you recall, it essentially computes the length or the magnitude of the vectors that you might have. So if you take this entries that we have, and if you take the L1 norm of this, right, essentially what you're doing, given a vector, you're summing up the elements of the vector. So if you look into the vector, which is defined by this variable vec, right, this is essentially 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. That's the vector vec. And if you add them individual entries that is there, it will come out to be equal to 15, and that's what has been outputted by this function norm, which is basically a function in the NumPy library that you have. Now, similarly, you can also do the L2 norm, or the second norm of the vector that is there. Now, the L2 norm is calculated as the square root of the sum of the squared vector values that is there. And again, you can essentially, by default, this is the norm that you're computing when you're passing, right? So, and that's why when you see the command, which is L2 underscore norm is equal to norm vec, right? There is no second entry, and it's the same function that we are calling, and by default, this is the norm that people are, whenever you're calling norm function, by default it takes that it assumes that you're computing the L2 norm. You could have been more specific, and rather than just calling this vec, right, what you see in the round parenthesis, you can be more specific, and you can do inside the round parenthesis, that is first line of code, which is L2 underscore norm is equal to norm in the parenthesis vec. You can do vec comma and put 2, and that will be explicit way of telling this norm function that you are interested in computing the L2 norm of the vector that is there. Okay, so again, by default, so that's why you don't need to specify the second element, but you can also use the specific or explicit way of calling the x2 norm, where you can do a comma 2 in this function, and that will help you do it. So let's execute this. Okay, so you can see the L2 norm will basically take each individual element of the vector, right, square them, add them up, and then take a square root of overall that, and that will be the resultant L2 norm of that vector. So if you take that, carry that out operation for the vector that we have defined above, which is this vector 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right, for that the L2 norm will come out to be equal to 7.41698, and so on. Okay. Similarly, you can also compute the max norm, right, which is essentially the maximum vector value. Okay, and what we do in order to do the max norm is we again use the norm function of the NumPy that is there, right, but we specify, right, not the first, we specify that INF, which is the short for infinity, because we are interested in creating the L to the power infinity or infinity norm of the vector that is there. So this is the way you specify. So if you look into the command that is listed here, which is max underscore norm is equal to norm in the round parenthesis, we have vector comma INF, which is short for infinitive. That helps us in essentially computing the maximum vector value that you have. Okay, and so let's execute this block of code that is there. And if you execute it, the maximum norm came out to be 5. And why? Because if you look at this vector, right, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, what is the maximum value of the element that you see in this vector? The maximum value element that you see in this vector is 5, and L infinity is essentially, the maximum vector value. So that's why you will see that the max norm output then you took resulted in essentially a value of 5 and so on. So that's what you see here. Max norm came out to be equal to